of this event for all the work you've been doing and are still doing, juggling electronic plates and things like that. Thanks to everyone who's decided that the next 60 minutes of their time are worth spending mostly with me. I've opted, rather than having slides, because I looked at the slides I'd made and they all just had words on them. So I tried as an experiment to make a handout instead. There's a link in the chat. If you've joined very recently, it's possible that you won't be able to see it. And if so, maybe just say in the chat. That just takes you to a file that you can relate to at your own place. So if I'm getting boring, you can read ahead, or if you lose the will to live for a moment, you can see what I said without having missed a slide. And I'm going to follow the handout quite closely because it's my only hope of sticking to time on this topic. Okay, so I'm talking about the priority of preferences in the evolution of minds. And obviously there are lots of questions you can ask about the evolution of minds or cognition, but some of them are questions corresponding to the folk psychological kinds of belief, what an agent represents as being the case, and desire, what it is that an agent wants. And it's those questions about the evolution of the folk psychological kinds that are my starting point today. Then it's going to be very much in the background, but I'm not going to explicitly defend it, but you should know that I'm adopting the general approach in Godfrey Smith's Complexity and the Function of a Mind in Nature and Sterelny's Thought in a Hostile World. That's the view called the environmental complexity thesis. And in its kind of t-shirt or bumper sticker version, that's the view that the function of cognition is to enable the agent to deal with environmental complexity. And to say that in a little more detail, what that means is something like the following thought. The world in which an agent finds itself, especially a living agent, is sometimes heterogeneous in ways that matter to the agent. And when the world is heterogeneous in ways that matter, it's not going to generally be the case that an appropriate behavior or activity is reliably or simply related to surface features that the animal can detect or that the creature can detect. Okay. And so to think about that, compare the situation of a herring gull. That's one kind of nesting bird. They make their nests on the ground. Under most ecologically realistic conditions, the only thing that isn't part of the nest that's likely to be in a herring gull's nest is an egg that it's laid itself. And early behavioral ecologists found, unsurprisingly, that herring gulls were pretty tolerant about what they would brood or sit on in the nest, right? Because it was the early days, some of their cigarettes came in tins rather than cardboard boxes, and the birds would sit on rolls of camera film or cigarette tins and things like that. Compare that with reed warbler, which is the most common example, although there are other species of birds that are parasitized by cuckoos. Sometimes the things in a reed warbler's nest are eggs laid by cuckoo chicks, which can look quite a bit like their own eggs. Unsurprisingly, because being brood parasitized is a very bad evolutionary outcome, reed warblers are quite a bit more choosy about what they'll sit on, right? And that extra cognitive investment, the thought is that's a way of coping with the environmental complexity. So that's the very general idea. And in his 2003 Thought in a Hostile World, Sterelny develops a view, I'm just introducing this as an example, where there two sub-properties that he identifies. One he calls robust tracking, and that's when the detection of a state isn't dependent on a relatively simple single feature, but can depend on integrating multiple cues, some of which might be delayed, so records of previous experiences. And on the other hand, something that he calls response breadth, which is having different outbound paths from a representational state, having more than one available course of action. And he develops a kind of scenario where the combination of those two together, right, the robust tracking, which means representational states which have a richer, more multimodal sensitivity to features of the world the organism has encountered, and response breadth together can give what he calls belief-like states. He's careful not to call them beliefs, so he sometimes uses the term decoupled representations. And that's a scenario where, under certain conditions, he's absolutely not saying this is inevitable, something that's on the way to belief could evolve as a kind of response to environmental complexity. Okay. And I just emphasized there the importance of the term belief-like, but I'm going to emphasize it again when in this talk I'm very much not talking about what we might think of as the personal states of practically rational agents. We're thinking about evolutionary processes focused on non-human, non-hominin agents, and about intermediate steps on the way to things that a philosopher might recognize as a belief or desire. And so just to fix that a little bit more clearly, when I talk about belief-like states here or decoupled representations, I mean to some degree decoupled, not narrowly bound to a stimulus, world-representing state that, to borrow some distinctions from Robert Brandom, might be only fairly shallowly conceptual, right? It might just classify or label without describing, have only modest inferential and no compositional capacity, but nonetheless it represents some property of the world and can maybe represent distal or remembered facts or something like that. And then on the other hand, although I haven't talked about them very much yet, proto-desires don't think of the personal, rich, goal-representing states like finishing my PhD or something like that might be important parts of our own desire economies, or that could feature in rationalizations of intentional action. I'm going to use preferences as my default proto-desire, and mean by that only a motivational state that prioritizes among at least some of, doesn't have to be the whole set, the available actions of an agent. So just a kind of ranking over an action portfolio, or at least some significant part of it. Okay, so those are the two targets, a sort of proto-belief and preferences, which are a proto-desire. And then I'm just going to make an observation here. It's very hard to make these kinds of arguments inductively, so I'm just going to parade a few exhibits, but I'd be very pleased, in fact, to hear of counterexamples. But the claim I'm going to make, and this is certainly my experience reading in the area, is that philosophers tend to prioritize belief-like states. Okay, I've already drawn from Godfrey Smith's Mind and Its Place in Nature, but the specific parts of that which are about a kind of possibly maybe history of cognitive apparatus are very much focused on true beliefs or accurate representations of facts about the world as a fuel for success, hardly anything about desire or motivation. I've mentioned Sterelny, the first part of Thought in a Hostile World, which is relatively directly about the folk psychological kinds. It's 3/4 about a genealogy of belief-like states, 1/4 about desire, and the quarter that is about desire is actually very deflationary, right? He's saying, look at all these things you could do without proto-desires, and so forth. Or a somewhat different example in Ruth Millikan's 2017 Beyond Concepts, kind of revisionist speculative theoretical psychology, where she's got these candidate terms as replacements for concepts. Much more of her treatment there is about what she calls factic unitrackers, which are sort of decoupled representations, relatively little about what she calls the affording ones, which are the more action guiding ones that may do motivation-like work. So with that background, one key thing about this talk is I'm going to organize things differently, and I'm going to mostly focus on preferences and desires. Mostly focuses on preferences, and belief-like states or proto-beliefs will be a supporting character. Okay, on to section 2. So in a paper from a few years ago, I develop and defend what's presented as an environmental complexity thesis case for the evolution of preferences. I just want to very, very briefly gloss that argument because it's background for everything that comes after. So the key claim in the paper, or the key thesis in the paper is something I now looking back in it, I think this is kind of pompous, but I'm stuck with the label: the efficiency rationale for preferences, which is the claim that preferences enable efficient action selection. By the end of the paper, there's a more complicated qualified version, but that's enough for now. And there are two main parts to the argument for that. On the one hand, there's an argument that achieving efficient action selection can be genuinely difficult, right? That it really is a case of being confronted with heterogeneity that matters or that makes a difference. And then there's a second argument that having preferences is a promising way of dealing with that particular complexity. So, and the argument for the first part, right, why might achieving efficient action selection be difficult? Well, mostly because the costs and returns on actions are varying and typically combine a bunch of different modalities together in irregular ways, right? There's always a time cost. Sometimes there's a non-trivial calorie cost and a risk cost of exposure to predation or some kind of danger. And the benefits might themselves be calories or hydration, rest, specific nutrients, mating opportunities, avoiding a predator, either having or not having an encounter with a rival, things like that. It's very, very it's a very mixed bag, but choosing between actions in an efficient way requires somehow navigating all of that. And the thought that preferences are, in some sense, a plausible design solution is just to say, well, if there were some intermediate prioritizing states that were sensitive to both the needs of the organism and properties of the available action repertoire, that could make a difference, right? And so if there was some mechanism that, in the example in the handout, if the animal is somewhat dehydrated, that would tend to uprank the priorities associated with drinking actions, or that maybe would rank them if just really convenient low-risk opportunities were nearby, right? It could be an opportunity cost notion. And so the thought there is some kind of system of preferences is a plausible way of responding to the difficulty of achieving efficient action selection. Okay, and that's going to be in the background in what follows. Okay, so that very, very briefly is section 2. So kicking off section 3, I want to look back at two things I've spoken about, right? Recall I very, very briefly glossed the main features in one way of summarizing it of Sterelny's thought that combining robust tracking and response breadth can give decoupled representations, which we might want to recognize as a belief-like state or a candidate for something that's on the way to full belief. And I've just given a sketch of an argument of my own that says, well, here's a non-trivial functional job for preferences to do in the evolution of cognition, and preferences it's useful to think of as being kind of on the way to desires. Well, even in a best case scenario, so let's suppose hypothetically that Kim's story about decoupled representation is right, and my story about preferences is sort of on the right track. What have these things got to do with each other, right? And I think that's worth thinking of because, of course, it's familiar to us in the full folk psychology case that you don't get explanations or rationalizations of action with one of them on its own, right? We rationalize an intentional action on the optimistic version of the story by reference to both a belief and a desire, right? So I don't merely go to the fridge because there's a water jug in it, but because there's a water jug in it and I want a glass of cold water. And recognizing that, we might think, well, maybe something like that goes for proto-beliefs and proto-desires. Maybe they had to evolve together, or maybe we might think one of them could have come first and the other come to play some sort of supporting role, despite the prima facie implausibility of that. If we start with the full folk psychology case, that gives us reason to think that either of them on their own isn't actually going to give us either causes or explanations of behavior. Okay. And I want to pause out, of course, that both in the history of deliberate invention and in the history of life, the order of innovation can sometimes take surprising forms, or at least prima facie surprising forms, right? Canning was invented for quite a long time before specialized can openers because there are advantages to canning. And if you're committed to it and have other relatively generic tools, even in old school heavy duty cans, there are ways of opening a can. Or in the history of digestive systems, there was a kind of long distressing period, it seems, when many living things that engaged in some kind of internal digestion had a single cavity that was used for everything, right? Before the invention of the kind of conveyor belt digestive tract with an input end and an output end. And again, that's not the way you would start if you were engineering an organism from cells you were culturing or something like that. But nonetheless, it seems to be the history of life. Okay. So given that cautionary note to be open to surprising orders, which I'm just going to take as an excuse, I don't think it's a knockdown of the folk psychology thought that you need both. But I want to say we can at least entertain a few options, right? Either proto-beliefs and proto-desires develop together and eventually reach the bright sunlit uplands of folk psychology, and that might have been because they developed as, at least for some of the time, as one thing that sort of did both jobs and then became differentiated. So they could have been like what Ruth Millikan for a while at least was calling push me pull you representations that were both descriptive and imperative. Or we can think that one of the two came first. And what I want to spend the bulk of the rest of this trying to do is selling the thought that there's a defensible, a coherent scenario, which is a version of the second one, that one of the two came first, and what that second one is preferences, right? So my title has at least two meanings: the priority of preferences in the sense that I'm focusing on them, but it also refers to a possible priority in the order of evolution. Right, so I'm on to section 4. Okay, and the first argument I want to introduce is it's not going to be formal in the way I introduce it, but I call it formal because it refers to a certain group of formal facts from the field of reinforcement learning. It's the argument from reinforcement learning. And the short version of the argument is simply pointing out that model-free reinforcement learning, referring to a family of models and techniques in computer science, can solve some efficient action selection problems, right? That there are problems of learning how to make moves in certain games or otherwise allocate groups of capacities where there's a definite notion of efficiency applied by the designers, and model-free reinforcement learning can, subject to some constraints, learn to solve, as in produce optimal or near optimal behavior, whole classes of those problems. Okay, so really what this section is about is unpacking that a bit. So in model-free reinforcement learning, something that's called an agent, it's not an agent in any rich sense, but a system that's got certain specified properties, learns what is sometimes, not always, called a policy, which maps between states and actions, things that it can do based on a reward signal. You can do model-free reinforcement learning by evolutionary methods, which means you make a whole bunch of different policies and kill off the ones that are lousy and make near variants and run the Darwinian process again. And you can also do it with genuine individual learning, in which case the agents go around applying their policies, but on the basis of the reward signal they get from the environment, incrementally fine-tuning the policy. And it's that second kind, really. I think there's a way of running my argument that talks about the evolutionary methods too. I want to focus on the individual learning ones. And so the policies are revised on the basis of the reward consequences of actions made applying whatever the current policy is, a gradient ascent or descent, depending on whether you like the hills to be up or the valleys to be down, learning. So why might it matter? What's it got to do with the other things I'm talking about, that model-free reinforcement learning can solve some efficient action selection problems? Well, there are two reasons for that. One is that reinforcement learning, I think, very, very clearly involves preferences. Policy organizes actions conditional on states into relations of being better than or as good as one another. And the reward signal, which reinforcement learning agents attempt to optimize, is a unidimensional numerical value attached to states and compared to expectations, right? When the agent makes some kind of adjustment to the policy when and only when the current reward magnitude is better than or worse than whatever the expected one was. And so that comparison of degrees of goodness and badness, or placing available actions into an ordering, it's essential to the architecture. So I think we can say that's preference-like functionality, even if it's not explicitly represented as a utility function or something like that. And then the second point, just what it means. These are the rules of the way the terminology is used in the literature. What it means to be model-free is, in some important sense, to lack an independent world representation, right? A model in the typical simple cases is an offline a kind of simulation of how states follow states, or how states follow actions, or how states and actions can be chained together, which can then be evaluated in various ways to value immediately available states on the basis of longer term consequences, right? So it really represents the dynamics of the world as the model has learned it. And by definition, model-free reinforcement learning systems don't have those. And I think that fits with the idea, right, that if our proto-beliefs are in some sense decoupled representations, then by the rules of the reinforcement learning conversation, these things don't have those. And so there's a way that model-free reinforcement learning provides a kind of existence proof showing a class of systems that can deliver efficient action selection with preferences, but without decoupled representations. And there's lots more that we can say about that. I want to highlight some good news and some bad news. The good news, right, because especially if some of this is new to you, you might be worrying, look, people can always, almost always cook up a toy system that has some desired property, you know, make an agent-based model where this or that happens, and then get overexcited, and they're not really very biologically plausible, or they don't tell us anything particularly illuminating about brains. I think the good news is that these very much aren't toy systems, and that's leaving their successes in electronic applications, because it's been known quite well for quite some time, even if the details are still contentious, that the brains of at least some real agents are doing something very, very like reinforcement learning. So the citation that's in the handout is to the 97 paper by Schultz, Day, and Montague, where the big take-home message was anyone who might have thought dopamine is the pleasure molecule or something like that is clearly incorrect, because the timing of dopamine activity makes vastly more sense on the thought that what it is it's a reward prediction error, right? Clear neural evidence that some kind of reinforcement learning is going on. And that encourages the thought that, right, it doesn't get you directly to a conclusion about the history of life, but it encourages the thought that these things are relevant to what happens with real brains. But there's also some less good news. Desktop reinforcement learnings aren't comprehensively neurally plausible, and many of them, and I'm not criticizing the research program by this, I'm only highlighting it because it's relevant to this argument, they're unrealistic in pre-classifying states of the world, right? Even if you're making a model-free reinforcement learning system to play chess, you typically won't include the problem of interpreting a real board from a camera. You'll just tell the system there's a bishop on square b3 or something like that, right? And that's because you're focused on move selection, not on perception and so forth. But I think that that's relevant because those systems are very often being given a free pass on cataloging the world in which they make their actions, and that weakens them as a tool for arguing that in the history of real embodied organisms, there's a plausible trajectory that starts with preferences but doesn't include. One further thing, these models often tend, they're absolutely counterexamples to this, but quite disembodied, right? Certainly, except as a special attraction in a robotics department or something like that, people won't bother to make a chess computer that has to pick up and move pieces on the board or something like that. It will just spit out a move, you know, knight to d4, and that's the end of its job. Okay, but I think there's a complementary argument that starts very much at the other end and meets up in the next place. So I'm moving on to part B of section 4 now, the argument from final common paths. So you might not have thought thought of this before, but just that you did with your body, you had a custom limb or appendage of some kind, right? So I would have a pen picking up thing and a nose scratching thing and a spectacle moving thing. It would be like a sort of anatomical extreme case of a Swiss Army knife with a whole lot of specialized tools. Pretty clear, without much thought at all, that that's not an efficient way to go about things, right? That it would involve a huge amount of physical real estate, part of body, and lots of it would only be very rarely used. Okay, I don't know how many times a day I scratch the end of my nose, but not enough to justify anything like, I mean, maybe if it was a tiny one built onto my face, but in general, that's very, very inefficient. And it's not surprising, although I think it's worth thinking about more often, that one solution in certainly most real multicellular bodies is to have hierarchically organized multiple use organs. The most obvious example is something like the jointed limb, which might be used for both walking and scratching and climbing and hitting or fighting, and if it's got any gripping capacity for handling and things like that. And so you have a collection of capacity used for all of different functions. And I mentioned that stuff, which it probably all sounds really obvious, in order to highlight something about it, which is that it creates a scheduling and control problem, one of switching between these multiple use capacities, and also of blocking incompatible uses, and incompatible in two senses. Although one could expand this list, there's incompatible just in the sense of inefficient. So if we tense the muscles on both sides of a joint, it's more effortful and in other ways less efficient to make movements, but also incompatible in the sense of impossible, right? If I've scratched my right ear and now want to scratch my left ear, I don't take the shortest path, right? I don't push that way. I go round the head. There are various ways in which my body creates its own constraints on deployments of its capacities. And both of these are exemplary economic problems. They involve the allocating scarce means with alternative uses. I say in the next bullet point in the handout, final common paths are a generic solution. That's too long, that's much too strong. They're a significant part of a generic solution. They don't solve the economic problem, but they help with some of the scheduling and control. The term final common path was introduced by Sherrington in the early 20th century, and important early text in neurology. And in Sherrington's understanding, he was thinking of the interaction between what he called reflexes, which were complete pathways from some kind of surface irritation or stimulation to a behavior at the other end. And his idea of a final common path then is of the last place in the nervous system where effectively some act of switching could be done that chose between incompatible reflexes. We don't need to hang on to the reflex vocabulary, let alone, of course, Sherrington's own dualism. So we can have a sort of liberalized notion of final common paths. And what they amount to is just a sort of a lattice, also to a significant extent, hierarchical structure of arbitration relations in the nervous system that may or may not be used, but places where decisions in a very subpersonal sense can be made between deployments of the body. And in the very, very simple cases, it's something like, if I want to touch my shoulder, that involves contracting my bicep. When I do it that way, I do that more efficiently if at the same time the quadricep and tricep are relaxed, just as the opposite goes for if I move out. That's a very, very simple case, is a potentially antagonistic pair of muscles. Or it might be a more complicated thing when people first learn to tie shoelaces. They tend to be relatively small and not that great at balancing, so they'll sit down to do it. When people get older again, they need to sit down, and that's just because the demands of the action are inconsistent with high confidence balancing, right? So sometimes it can be a more complicated and a larger set of bodily relationships. And what I want to point out about that, right, that's a very, very common feature of the organization of motor systems and so forth. And it absolutely doesn't have to involve preferences. There can be reflexes and other kinds of process that are involved in making the switches between the incompatible allocations. But final common paths provide a convenient functional place for preferences to be exercised. There's some nice and quite long discussions of this in Paul Glimcher's 2011 book, which I mentioned there. But just to flesh out the idea a little bit more vividly, some important early work in the field of neuroeconomics precisely involved monitoring activity in topographic maps, which were only a little bit upstream of final common paths. And the particular topographic maps were connected with the control of saccadic movements, the ballistic movements we make with our eyes. And if the skull is being kept still, those are very, very simple movements and controlled with a small number of pairs of muscles that move the eye up and down, left and right within the socket. And the topographic maps correspond to saccade target positions, right? And the particular circuits that they were studying operate on a sort of threshold winner-take-all basis, where the first candidate saccade target to pass some threshold is the winner. Every other candidate is reset, and the process kind of recycles. Those movements are very, very clearly, strictly mutually exclusive. If I saccade over this way with my right eye, I can't be saccading anywhere else at the same time, right? It's a pointer that can only point in one direction. And what it is that Platt and Glimcher found was that activity in that area was not only predictive, right? So if there were sort of two areas of activity before a saccade, the more intense activity predicted what saccade was likely to happen. They found that, but they found in experimental paradigms where the experimental subjects were choosing between saccade targets and the consequences of choosing varied over the course of the experiment, right? So you'd get paid with more fruit juice for looking to the right some of the time, or the one on the left would pay out more reliably or less reliably or something like that. That the activity in those topographic maps of saccade targets was proportional to the expected reward, right? So there's a switching station for a quite simple set of final common paths, and that's precisely where some of the neuroeconomic evidence of localized valuation processes was found. And indeed, this is sort of perhaps an aside, but I think it's useful to add to the picture. It seems likely that in the actual evolution of brains, the difference between motor arbitration between the kind of gating functions that relate to relaxing the muscles on one side of a joint when you're tensing the other one. And reward learning is a matter of degree, that neural reinforcement learning began as and still bears traces of being an elaboration of motor gating. And I think that that supports the earlier argument because right, you'll recall that I referred to model free reinforcement learning as being a kind of existence proof of efficient action selection with preferences, but without any world modeling. The worries were that systems of those kinds tended to be highly embodied, I beg your pardon, disembodied, and worries about taking shortcuts on neural plausibility in particular. And I think these considerations about final common paths and the empirical convergence of some important work on neuroeconomics and final common path architectures to a significant extent addresses both of those, right? This is an argument that starts with thinking about embodiment and ends with reinforcement learning. So I think that that supports the earlier argument. I'm hoping to hear a bunch of objections, so I've only prepared one myself. I'm hoping at least someone's thinking along these lines, so we're on to the final stretch. You might be worrying these scenarios don't really lack proto-beliefs. And one way of getting to that worry would be to be thinking something like that, at the very least, they involve perceptual proto-beliefs. Right? If you're valuing something in your action portfolio in a certain way, conditional on the detected state of the world in your own body, well, then you're in the state detecting business. Why not extend this permissive approach to decoupled representation to include those? And I don't think that'll work. I think there's more to proto-belief, which involves some degree of decoupling than mere discrimination or classifying. I think if we counted discrimination or low-level classifying or stimulus generalization as being a representation of the agent, not of a subsystem, that would be too permissive. I think it would dilute the explanatory point of postulating and sometimes successfully finding intermediate world modeling states. So I'm not keen on that, but maybe somebody wants to talk about it. But I still think, given that that objection is not decisive, it's reasonable to say that the reinforcement learning argument, supplemented by the final common path considerations, which take bodies and so forth seriously, encourage the thought that preferences could have preceded decoupled representation. There are a couple of other bullet points on the handout, but I'm mindful of the time, and so I'm going to stop there because I'm keen to hear what everyone else has to think. So that's a wrap. Thank you.